Well, this should be exciting. Last week we looked at the Z590 Vision D by Gigabyte. Today we're going to do an unboxing of the ASUS ProArt B550 Creator right here. I think they sell these motherboards by the pound. I'm excited about this. This is what we call our second level. The last video we did was what we call our primary entry-level machine, and we made a case why to build it. We made a case why not to build it. And today we're kind of in the same boat because based on some of the questions we've had, and I think Max pretty well summed it up. As Max said, he had to build on a lesser platform before he got to realize where the value and where the best specs are for the money. And that refers to our favorite, which is the Gigabyte TRX40 designated motherboard. By the way, folks, this is Builder by Welcome. My name is Gil Boyd. Thanks for joining us. Glad you're here. So we're going to do an unboxing. We're going to talk about this, the reasons why not to. I've got some notes I'm going to cover. I'm going to try to keep this as tight as I can because as we explore the notes, some of this stuff may seem like a rabbit hole, but if you're trying to build, it's relevant. Do you build an entry-level machine? And the way we're going to break it out, I hope is going to make a lot of sense. So let's get started. We're going to open this box up. We're going to do an overhead and take a look at what we've got, and we'll compare that to the manual. Now, some of the information I want to share with you, I'm going to have some links up that will show whatever we don't get to because there's a lot going on as we look at the entry level, which is a 10 core, this machine, which will be a 16 core, the next level, which is a 32 core, the high-end desktop, and then of course the workstation. That information from a bibliography standpoint we'll have up in the description of the video, so you can read all that information there. There's a lot going on. Even got wind of some issues with some video cards. A new video card's been announced by AMD. It's an AMD Radeon Pro, and it's going to have 32 gigs on it. They're going to have a 32 gig version and an 8 gig version. There ought to be a 16 gig version, but there's not. So right now we're trying to help Nathaniel trying to get a video card. He's in the same boat all of us are in. No matter which one of the 4 levels of computers you're trying to build, whether it's an entry-level machine with 10 cores, and we're going to address some of the issues we had. I believe it was Danielle was talking about, what's this issue with capture? I don't understand that as it relates to video, as it relates to audio. And I believe Danielle pointed out, it's a little confusing when you're talking about capturing. Are we talking about video? Are we talking about audio? Are we talking about multiple sources? We're going to lay some of that out, but we're at this level that we want to take you to so we can bring you along, because after we do this unboxing, we're going to go after the 4K, and really 4K is it a feature or benefit, but the purpose of it is we're going to start with capturing and streaming. So we're going to look at the hardware. What we may do is a video that talks about the technology and where it's come through, what we've done the last 8 years. Kind of boggles your mind when you think about that we can capture and stream on a computer. And we're going to address some of the where you do the hardware, whether you do it with software. And I will say, keep in mind, anything software can do a fine job, but anything software can do, hardware can do a whole lot better. So let's get this out of the box and see where we've got. Now, number one about this board, because this is the ASUS ProArt B550, we're going to have Thunderbolt 4 on this motherboard. If you want Thunderbolt 4, you got 2 directions you can go. It's Intel or AMD. The board we looked at in the previous video was Intel on a 500 series chipset. That, of course, is the Gigabyte Z590 Vision D. And this is the piece de resistance. If you want Thunderbolt 4, it's going to be built onto the motherboard, and there's some things about Thunderbolt we need to look at, whether it's built on the motherboard or whether it's an add-in card. Another nice thing about this is because this is an ASUS ProArt motherboard, ProArt for content creation opens up a whole new world that we're going to get into when we start talking about monitors as we scale that up. And another nice thing about this, again, like the previous machine, because this is a ATX form factor, this could be rack mounted for a purpose-built machine. Now, for anyone that's going to do video, either machine would do most of what you want. We're going to look at some specs for some audio, for digital audio workstation, because that was the one thing. Now, to answer Danielle's question, we're going to look at this from 2 perspectives. 1, content creation for video, and 2, content creation for audio, and see what the requirements are. I've got some information that we'll extrapolate from some specs that we'll use to talk about as we look at this, because for content creation, we think this is a good place to be. The entry-level 10-core, this machine for 16-core. And AMD has just announced a press release that we'll find out in about 7 days with the AMD 5000 series processors. Right now, the processor we recommend that we have on the spec sheet is the 5950. We may have something beyond that in a couple of weeks. We'll see. Let's go overhead. As we get this out of the board, nice presentation. ASUS ProArt B550, and we purchased this direct from ASUS because we didn't know what kind of trouble we were going to have getting our hands on the board. The board's fairly easy to find, but everything is in such a state of flux right now. Any machine you want to build, you got to get a video card. No video card, no computer. And that was the advantage of the one that we looked at previously. We had video built on board. First question being, is it better to have video on board or is it better to have video on the video card for the purpose of Thunderbolt? 4K 30 on board, 4K 60 external video card. Now the ASUS ProArt B550 does not have a CPU in the class we're talking about for 16 cores that will do video on the CPU. But what we do have, even though it's the B550 chipset, and we made a case X570 chipset, but if you want Thunderbolt 4, this is where we're at. So first thing I want to do is take a look at the sticker. I can check out, I've got a serial number, I've got a part number, and I've got the model number. And a lot of times, used to, they would tell you what BIOS you have, and we don't see that anymore. Another question that comes up is about, can I put an M.2 card in here? We're going to address that. This also can do RAID. We're going to address that. And of course, the most important issue is number one, Thunderbolt 4, and number two, 16-core processor. Because this is an education process. As Nathaniel has asked, he had a 10-year machine we looked at with the Level 1 machine. So I'm going to reference some of this to what Nathaniel has mentioned, some of this to what Max has talked about, because I think Max pretty much said it. He had to build that lower-end machine before he realized the better deal on the higher-end machine. So I want to go through this and look at the resources and see how that's allocated. On paper, we were pretty gung-ho about the X570 chipset. On paper, it looked great. Now, we had another subscriber that come along that had an ASUS motherboard, ASUS number 1 for bifurcation, because he could bifurcate, but number 2, because it was ASUS, ASUS supports that feature. He had that 1 16-lane slot that's required. We're going to see how those resources work out, because there's a lot of things you can do on these boards, but the problem a lot of people are finding is you can't do everything all at once. And that goes back to a question that Danielle, as we tie all this together. As she said, I don't understand, because used to when you built a digital audio workstation, you built it purpose-built for that one thing and you didn't do anything else. Well, you can have stuff, all these things installed, you just can't do everything at once. Same goes for the resources on this motherboard, so it's important we look at those PCI Express resources. We're going to do that, and we'll extrapolate. Now, the nice thing about this box has got a seal on it. We did not have that on the Gigabyte board. I like that. So I'll break the seal, or cut the seal. We'll open this up, and we have a motherboard in a bag. That I appreciate. And we need to inventory what we've got. And when we start talking about the bag, interesting, the bag does not have tape. So the box had a seal on it, and it was an ASUS tag, but the bag does not have tape on it. So I just want to point that out. Before I get this out, I want to take a look at the documentation here for everything that comes with it. We lift the cardboard out, and wow, have they simplified what comes with it. We have a motherboard manual. We have a driver CD, Control Center Express. Use the license key during the deployment of ACC. Another feature. Very important, and we have 3 cables. We have 3 packages. One we have looks like a couple of pads. One package with 2 SATA cables, one straight, one right angle, and then the all-important cable to get DisplayPort with a part number. So a whole lot simpler setup than what we had with the previous motherboard, but that's only part of it. Now again, for someone that's never built a computer, the question about, yes, I'm grounded, you can check that out in the manual. This is for ESD. I have anti-static gloves on. I'm grounded to the mat. The mat's grounded to the wall. I know the ground is consistent. I have continuity. I know the humidity. I know the temperature, so I'm good to go. The question comes up about the box your materials come in. Keep it for the life of the warranty, because otherwise, if you have any issues, you have to deal with the vendor, or even if like you need the sticker, what we found on the last one, we could not find the serial number of the product information on the corner of the motherboard. So I'll just say it's on your box. If you have anything you need to deal with the manufacturer, you're going to need that information. Remember that. So we're going to get this out, and we'll orient this north, south, east, and west, north being the top, and we'll go through some of the resources. 4 memory slots, 24-pin power, and the other 2 power taps. The 8-pin and the 4-pin are right up here. Fan headers. This has some hefty heat sinks on it compared to the previous motherboard. And we have 2 M.2 connectors we can put on here. M.2 PCI Express 4.0, the primary and the secondary. And here's where it gets into some fuzzy stuff. Now I will say with the documentation, we're not going to have a document like we had previously where we can look at the diagram. I like the diagram to see how the plumbing works. So what we're going to have to do is extrapolate from the specs and look at the motherboard layout and go from there. Now from the I/O panel, and for those that are new to building, like when Robert Collier was asking, that I/O panel is now built on, so there's nothing to be placed on. What I find curious is they chose to use a PS2 port for the keyboard and mouse. I haven't seen one of those on the motherboard in probably 8 years. So your two USB 2 ports are right here. That's where you put the keyboard and mouse. It's got the BIOS flashback feature right here, where you've got a button and you got an LED right here. This also has a little piece of plastic covering this, so of course you'd want to peel that off. But what's more important is we get down here to the two USB-C ports. This motherboard is flipped the interface compared to what the other one was. So we have HDMI down here, and that's HDMI out, and we have DisplayPort in. So if you want to get video into your USB-C port, and it's only going to come in through the first port, USB-C 1, you got to bring it in through that DisplayPort, which means you got to have a video card. You got to have a video card anyway. So remember, Thunderbolt does three things. One, video, but you have to inject video to get video out of Thunderbolt. Number two, you've got data connectivity. And number three is power if you want to route power through it. Now, Thunderbolt 4 is supposed to have increased two things. One, power delivery to 100 watts. As we saw on the last board, it was still at 60 watts. So we can check and see what we can find out about that. And the other issue was because of, is it better for Thunderbolt to have video built on the motherboard, or is it better to have video for Thunderbolt through the video card? Okay, on the previous machine, as we saw, if video is through the CPU, that's 4K 30. If you want 4K 60 out of Thunderbolt, you got to do that through the video card. But again, what we've realized now that we've looked at two motherboards that have Thunderbolt 4 on them, even though you can route video in, you're only routing video in to one Thunderbolt port. You don't get it on both ports. If you want Thunderbolt 4 on both ports, you have to use a separate external card. And because of the pinout, as we've mentioned in the Thunderbolt videos, and I'll mention again here, ASUS is going to a 14-1 pin header. Gigabyte has a 5-pin 3-pin header, and only ASRock is still using the 5-pin header. MSI, the only way I'm seeing right now them doing Thunderbolt 4 is it's built onto the motherboard, which to me implies, based on the two machines we've looked at, you may only get Thunderbolt 4 out of one port. I'd have to look at it and see how the routing is done. It's kind of like chipsets. We did a lot of research on X570. We looked at all the Gigabyte X570s, but we have not looked at everybody else's. We look at them as you guys ask a question, and when you'll have a question, we'll do the research because we know what we're looking for that we can extrapolate, such as how do the resources on this motherboard work out? Let's look at the manual and see what we've got, because as we look at the layout on this board, a good example would be these two M.2 slots. Even though we have two M.2 slots, that doesn't mean we can use them. Even though we have 3 slots, that doesn't mean we're going to use them. For example, we have 3 slots here. We have a 16-lane slot, an 8-lane slot, and a 4-lane slot. Okay, that 16-lane slot shares resources with this 8-lane slot. As long as we're using only one slot, we have 16 lanes. So with 16 lanes, we could put an M.2 card on here and bifurcate it, and the BIOS supports 4x4x4x4. On the previous motherboard, it supported bifurcation, but not 4x4x4x4. And the 4x4x4x4, you have to remember, each M.2 NVMe drive, whether it's PCI Express 3, PCI Express 4, or whatever, each M.2 drive has to have 4 lanes. So if you've got one slot with 16 lanes, that's 4 drives. Feel like a mime. It's just, that's the way the resources are allocated. However, because of these 2 slots, because they share resources, if we put something in that second 16-lane slot, which is 16 lanes mechanically, and the issue is with these slots, it's one 16-lane slot electrically and one 8-lane slot electrically. However, when you use the 2 slots simultaneously, because they share resources, guess what happens? You lose resources, so you have 2 8-lane slots. So therefore, if you put an M.2 card on here, you've got a third option to put a video card, and that's in that third slot, which is 4 lanes. Okay, here's the problem with that. Okay, keep in mind the number one reason for this motherboard is Thunderbolt 4, number 1. Number 2, it's on AMD, so we have 16 cores. Okay, keep that in the back of your mind. If we put an M.2 card on here and the video card has to go in that third slot, guess what happens to that third slot? Well, that third slot is either or. What do I mean by that? let's look at the documentation. We'll see. We're going to go ASUS Motherboard Support. We're going to download the manual. And while I'm here, I will say, in case I forget later, take a look at the CPU memory support. That's a really nice laid out menu. Okay, motherboard layout. PCI Express by 16_1, PCI Express by 16_2, and PCI Express by 16_3. Let's take a look now at the specification summary. Under expansion slots, if you're using a Ryzen 5000 series or a 3000 CPU, 2 PCI Express 4.0 by 16 slots, single by 16 or dual by 8. And if you're using a Ryzen 4000 processor, then you drop to PCI Express 3.0. Now those two are again to the CPU. On the AMD B550 chipset, 1 PCI Express 3.0 by 16 slot that supports by 4 mode. So it's by 16 mechanically, it's by 4 electrically. And it's got 2 little stars up there. And we also have 2 PCI Express 3.0 by 1 slots, and those have 3 little stars. The 2 little stars. PCI Express supports PCI Express bandwidth bifurcation for RAID on CPU, which is 4x4 by 4x4. PCI Express 3.0 by 4 for that slot will be switched from Thunderbolt 4. Now think about that. The number one reason for this motherboard is Thunderbolt 4, but let's keep going. PCI Express 3.0 by 4, which is the third slot, will be switched from Thunderbolt 4 to the PCI Express by 16_3 if the slot is populated. By then, Thunderbolt 4 will have no output. Yeah, no kidding, to go figure. So there's a lot of things we can do, we just can't do everything at once. And that's the issue with these lower end machines. That's why, like Max said, he had to build that to realize, you know, what you do and what you can do and what you want to do, but maybe two different things. Now let's just cut to the chase. What's the big difference? We looked at the numbers on the entry-level machine, and I can put those up and have them comparison for this video as well. I'll have a link in the PCPartPicker, and also appreciate if you use the links that we've got that go into Amazon, because that supports us. But as you look at what this is going to cost for this machine, an entry-level machine, which is 10 cores, if you want 10 cores, versus this machine, which is 16 cores, to me this is a no-brainer if this is what you want to do and this is what you want to stop with. But if you want to use everything, you can't use everything because you don't have the resources for it. You have to make some choices and some hard choices. Now, if Thunderbolt 4 is a requirement, that's the number one requirement. But if Thunderbolt 4 is one requirement and another requirement is you want to have an M.2, well, there's trade-offs, because as I have said before, and I'll reiterate from what I have said in the Thunderbolt videos, what we have seen, even though this is ProArt, and that is a technology in and to itself for managing a computer and its resources, and even though this has Thunderbolt 4, those two things are the reason we're looking at this machine. This motherboard can do a lot, but this chipset is limited with limited amount of resources. What you're looking at from a 10 core to a 16 core to a 32 core and then into a workstation, with the high-end desktop, you have the ability to have almost everything at once, with again some exceptions. But the conception I think most people have is an expectation that if it's there, I can do everything. And that's not the case, and that's the trade-off. If you want Thunderbolt 4, this is where you're at. If you can accept Thunderbolt 3, and if you look at the specs for Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4, there's no increase in bandwidth of the three things that Thunderbolt does as we look at these motherboards, whether it's Thunderbolt 3 or Thunderbolt 4. Number one, video. You're going to get video on one port. You have two Thunderbolt 4 ports. Yes, they're using the Maple Ridge, and Thunderbolt 3 is the Titan Ridge. However, of ththose three things, video being number one on one port, the other two things are data delivery. So if you're building a DAW, makes sense. If you want power delivery, I wouldn't use power delivery for a digital audio workstation audio interface. So if you need power delivery, because we had another subscriber asking about USB-C. And without opening up another can of worms, I'll just say that for another video, I just want to say that USB-C, if you want video over USB-C, that's actually the technology DisplayPort over USB-C. And I can put up some links to that because I've had a subscriber just ask the question. And just to keep it simple, of all these things going on, DisplayPort over USB-C is implemented on laptops and it's implemented on smartphones. I'm not aware of any motherboard, and we can take a look in the database, and I'll put a link up to that so you can check and verify for yourself. But I'm not seeing any motherboards that implement that technology that way. So if you want to get video over one cable, you want to do that over Thunderbolt. The question is, if you want Thunderbolt 4, this is where you're at. But if you want resources to do all these other things, and this is really my concern about where Thunderbolt is positioned, even though Thunderbolt is positioned for content creators, we can have it on the entry-level machine, and we can have it on this secondary level machine. But we cannot have right now, as the spec is defined and as it's been implemented, because what the spec says and the way it's implemented can be two different things. And we still don't know. The big what if is how ASRock is going to implement Thunderbolt 4. Right now, the specs for Thunderbolt 4 that ASRock has identified, that's also identified on the motherboard, so it's in different places and it's congruent, is that they're going to keep and maintain the 5-pin header. But we saw on one of the motherboards that in the BIOS settings, and ASRock had the best support I've seen of anybody, of the BIOS settings, there was a setting in the BIOS that had something to do with Titan Ridge, which is Thunderbolt 3 workaround. I don't know what that's about. So if you can accept, and this is where this is going, if you can accept Thunderbolt 3 on a high-end desktop or on a workstation, you're in business. And either one of those solutions is Gigabyte. But the best deal for the money is still the Gigabyte TRX40 Designator motherboard. And I know Max can testify to that as well. So I want us to keep going and look at these resources because I want you to understand what you're getting. Remember, number one, Thunderbolt 4. Number two, we're on the AMD platform and we're building a 16-core machine. Let's go back to the specs and look at some more of the what if. So that's one of the first gotchas. Something else we're going to look at, which is where we're going with the capturing and streaming, is we're going to look at capturing and streaming and kind of do an overview of where that's come from, because remember, anything that software can do, hardware can do better. So we're going to look at this from a hardware standpoint, what kind of capture card you can put in, because 4K is like, is this a feature or is this a benefit? As we look at the resources to put this on a motherboard, what we're going to do is we're going to have both motherboards up here. And I think it will help us to see what we can do if we're going to do 1080 capturing and streaming with a capture card, or if we think we want to do 4K capturing and streaming with a capture card, which one of these computers, the entry level 10 core or the secondary level 16 core, which one's going to be better? And from that standpoint, are they both the same? As we look at the slots that are available, let's go back to the motherboard. If we use this slot, we lose Thunderbolt. So if we're going to put a capture card in here, this is a good case for those single lane slots. And again, there's a setting in the BIOS to allocate as we look at the manual, because the next thing we have to look at are the M.2 slots. There's an M.2_1, which is PCI Express 4, and again through the chipset, there's an M.2_2 PCI Express 3. So now that question about RAID. Okay, we know this will support in that first slot 16 lanes, so we could put a bifurcated card on here. And we know that the BIOS has support for RAID. And we now know also the third thing, that if we put two M.2 drives in this machine, one's PCI Express 3 and one's PCI Express 4. What's the big difference in that? Well, PCI Express 4, first generation, could be 5,000 megabytes. Second generation could be 7,000 megabytes. And that's the transfer rate on the M.2 NVMe PCI Express drive. On PCI Express 3, 3,500 megabytes. So, no. Even though I can do RAID on here, I wouldn't. You have to prioritize. If you want to do a lot and you want to do more and you want to do a lot of these things at the same time, you gotta grade up. Now, one subscriber has asked a question because he's trying to do the scratch disk on a RAID setup and he's using a RAID card. He happens to have an ASUS motherboard and it happens to support 4x4x4x4 bifurcation. So number one, ASUS. Number two, full bifurcation. But number three, he actually has on his X570 chipset full support for a 16-lane slot. It's not shared. All the Gigabyte boards we looked at on the X570, they all share on that slot. So I can't make a blanket statement about this is the way it is on this chipset and this is the way this vendor does it. The only blanket statement we can make is if you have an ASUS motherboard number one, and number two, what model is it? And we can look it up and see, does it support bifurcation? It will, but the question is, based on the allocation of resources for that motherboard, for that chipset, will it do a full bifurcation so you can see 4 drives, which is 4 lanes for each drive, 4x4, 16. And that's where we get into this. It just, I know what I know and trying to share it with you guys. Again, I can give you a reason why to build this, and I can give you a reason why not to. And to reiterate, what you're looking at is a difference in a $300 motherboard versus a $600 motherboard. Now, that $600 motherboard is not that expensive when you factor in that you've got 2 add-in cards. One Thunderbolt 3 card, PCI Express 3.0, and 1 gigabyte Aorus M.2 PCI Express NVMe card by 16. Those are scarce as hen's teeth right now. Those 2 cards come with the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire. I got to emphasize that. So if you want to put something on here like this, the 2 options you've got, do I go with one of those, what they call a quad card? The price I won't even get into because it's ridiculous right now, and there's several different ways to get the different brands. And we have another video coming up on the Jai brand, which finally shipped, which will support 4 drives. But putting one of those kind of cards on this board, what this kind of board and the other board needs, if you're going to do something like that, is you need to use a self-bifurcated card. A self-bifurcated card is about the price of the motherboard. So if you want to do an M.2 card, you're still at $600 because those cards are expensive. We're going to do another video where we talk about the different levels of RAID and the different types of RAID. There are 3 types of RAID: the hardware RAID, a hybrid BIOS RAID, which is what we're trying to do, a poor man's RAID, and then you have the Windows RAID, which is, that's another video. So how far would I go with a machine like this? This would be appropriate, in my opinion, to build a digital audio workstation. What kind of rendering am I going to do? I can render video with this, and I can render audio with it. Now, as I look at this from a historical perspective, I guess it's been about probably 6 or 7 years ago, and I can put up some links to some information. We were looking at a machine, and this is relevant to an entry-level 1 and this system for system level 2. Well, we were 8 cores, 8 threads. Then we went from 8 cores, 8 threads to 8 cores, 16 threads. Okay, this is 16 cores, 32 threads. This is a leap. That was an 8350, and in that area of, I believe Nathaniel had, his 10-year-old machine was an 80, I believe Nathaniel had, I think it was an 8320. The point of it is, he had 8 cores, 8 threads. So for him to go to the entry-level machine, which is 10 cores, I don't think it's worth the trouble. He needs to go beyond that. He needs to be at least at this level, because the machine I was talking about that went from 8 cores to 8 threads, which is on the FX processors, to the, I'll just say the Ryzen 2nd generation, which would have been a Ryzen 1800, that was 8 cores, 16 threads. Now we're looking at 16 cores, 32 threads. Processing power matters. This is where you want to be. But the chipset that lets everything talk is the foundation that you want to get on the right platform, which is why I say the high-end desktop for PCI Express 4. And yes, I know, things are getting ready to change when PCI Express 5 comes out, because an M.2 NVMe drive, and that's really where the issue is with speed, is going to be able, what I have read, to go to 15,000 megabytes, which means new chipsets, new motherboards, new M.2 drives, and we do this all over again. But where we're at right now, if someone needs to build a machine, the question is, do I build this machine with a $300 motherboard that I could be looking at a $600 motherboard because of the M.2 card, because I need, and by the way, we had a video on the Glow Trends card, which can do that. It can take 8 lanes. It's a self-bifurcated card, but it's $300. And it, by the way, it's only PCI Express 3. So there's trade-offs. There's a way to do things, but there's trade-offs. You have to decide how you want to allocate those resources. This is a good little board for a purpose-built machine. Now, if I were going to use this to do streaming and capturing, because there's 2 ways that can go. Are we looking at this from a consumer or from a professional standpoint? In other words, are you streaming for yourself, or are you going to be streaming for somebody else? Because the other video that we're going to do later that I've mentioned before is about a rack mount. And either one of these machines could be purpose-built for a rack mount computer. There's reasons to do the level 1 for rack mount, but there's also reasons to do the level 2 for rack mount. A rack mount computer, when you go that route, you're not looking at one computer because you're doing it for yourself. If you're doing it for somebody else, you've got redundancy, so you got 2 computers. So one thing calls for something else. So if you've got to have 2 computers, that kind of changes things. And because of the issue with the video card, a purpose-built machine on those entry-level machines with 10 cores, they can do the job. At 1080. If I was doing 4K, I might have some concern for that. Now, I will say, based on the machines I've talked about, over the time frame and the 8 years we've been doing this for streaming, when we first started doing capturing and streaming, we weren't streaming video out live. We were capturing video, anything off of HDMI. That's easy, and I won't get into it any more than that. You'll have to read between the lines. But doing that helped me to understand the process of what's required to get that out when you go to your CDN, your content delivery network. And on a consumer level, Again, whatever software can do, hardware can do a better job. I'm going to address this from the hardware side. A lot of people are doing stuff through software to make everything work, and when you have a hiccup and the software hiccups, everything goes down. Whereas when you're doing hardware and you have everything contained, you maintain control of it. And that's what this is all about. Then you use some kind of a CDN, a content delivery network, that can take that one stream and send it out to multiple CDMs. Like if you want to go to YouTube, or if you want to go to Facebook and do it at the same time, or other sources. And as we go up that path, we may get into that. Let's get more back into the specs on this motherboard. Now again, on the Ethernet on this one, we have the same thing, 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. When you go up to a high-end desktop, you got 10 gigabit. Lots of USB ports, that's not going to be an issue. And I mentioned about Thunderbolt and how it's routed. And again, this is Thunderbolt 4 on AMD. That's the big thing. But it's only Thunderbolt 4 video on one port. Now, for the gentleman that asked about doing USB-C, because that's DisplayPort over USB-C, I'm not aware of any motherboards that support that. It's only on, to reiterate, laptops and smartphones. It'd be nice if they simplified this, but they're not. So that's what we're here to try to explain and help you guys figure this stuff out. So let's look at the motherboard again. So even though we've got 3 slots, if we use this slot, we need to keep this for a video card. If we put something over here, this becomes 8 lanes, this becomes 8 lanes. So putting an M.2 card is really not a good option. And if we try to use this 3rd slot, and if Thunderbolt 4 is a primary consideration, then that's not an option. So same thing with the 2 M.2 drives, PCI Express 4 here, PCI Express 3 here. I wouldn't use this because of the resource allocation. So that leaves these 2 slots. If these or this could be used, I would use these. And either one of these slots can take a capture card that can also stream that'll do 1080. And we'll do a separate video about that. So SATA ports, we've got 4 SATA ports. Used to be SATA ports were a big deal. And again, on a high-end desktop, you're probably going to have 6 or 8, depending on the motherboard you choose. One USB 3 header, which is the 20-pin header. It's at a right angle. And then straight up, multi-pin header for the USB-C connector for the front of the case. Plenty of fans on the bottom. And what's odd on this motherboard, if we look at the bottom of this, we've got a COM port down here. I haven't seen a COM port or a PST port, I don't know how long. Now, the reasons for that, at the moment it escapes me, unless it has something to do with management. A fan header, an RGB header, 2 RGB headers, another fan header, and there is a sensor. We have the sensor number 17, which is a thermal sensor, which would be a thermistor, but the cable's not included. You have to buy that extra. Gee, thanks, ASUS. So 2 USB 2 headers. Then number 13, the clear CMOS header. That comes in handy sometimes. And of course, here's our front pin panel header for the front of the case. Another fan header and another RGB header up here. So we've got a CPU fan header, a CPU optional fan, a pump header. It's a good looking motherboard. It's got a nice heat sink on it. I also like the fact that there's a cover on this where the chipset is at. That chipset fan will be easy to access and change if you have to. You got 4 screws that'll take that off. So it's a pretty simple board, but I think what we need to do now, let's go back and look at the components as what we have with PCPartPicker, 10 core, 16 core, and do a comparison. Now we'll have a link up to this. On the 10 core machine, this has video on board. You get an idea of the price, what your numbers are at. That's a $370 motherboard versus a $300 motherboard, and you got a $400 processor. And the machine we're looking at right now is the Ryzen 9 5950 with the ASUS ProArt B550. We have some memory in there. You can change it because as we look at this, compare the formula. And I think that's another point of distinction we need to point out. The best formula we have for content creation as it relates to what Adobe has put out is the Adobe After Effects Multi-Frame Rendering CPU Optimization Formula. And how does that play out and how does that figure in with this? Okay, it's the CPU core count times 4 equals the RAM. So if we've got 16 cores, 64 gigs of RAM. That's what we've got shown and configured here. That's a starting point. That's number 1. Number 2 is the CPU core count equals the video RAM. And that's the crux of the matter, and that's our biggest problem. So if we've got a 16-core CPU, we need a video card with 16 gigs of RAM. Nathaniel is looking at building a machine he wants to do gaming on. You could use a different motherboard, but you can overclock the memory on this as well. ASUS is good for overclocking. If you do something that doesn't like, the BIOS will reset historically and come back up, no problems. But you can also short out the BIOS in there. It's real easy to do. The last time we used an MSI board to get to the jumper to short the BIOS, we had to pull a video card to get to that jumper, and it was kind of a hassle. So if you're interested in overclocking, yes, you can use a different chipset, but again, this number one is Thunderbolt 4, number two, a 16-core build. So of those two primary considerations, I still think this is a good place to be. And another question was asked, well, what about processors? If I can't get my hands on a 5950, or if I think the 5950 is a little expensive, because right now you're probably going to pay a $150 premium for it. It's about an $850 processor if it's $1,000. So you're paying a premium for it. It is what it is. So if you look at one of the other processors, remember you want to keep PCI Express 4, but if you go to a lesser processor, and this relates to a question that we were asked, I believe it was Mosh86, and I may be pronouncing that incorrectly, asked the question about comparing, and Max also made reference to this. Now, Max has the same perspective that we do about where the best bang for the buck is. But this other subscriber asked the question about comparing what's the difference in, say, and Max had this same question at one time, about building the TRX40 versus the WRX80. Okay, CPU Benchmark has a real good score you can look at, but it's not about what the processor does, it's about what the chipset does, because the chipset rules, the chipset lets everything talk. And if you can live with two 16-lane slots and two 8-lane slots dedicated, for the most part on the average, that's what you're going to get with a TRX40. Now, specifically, that's what you get with a TRX40 Designaire. Some of the other configurations, they mess with some of that. But when you go to the workstation, what you're going to have is 7 slots, 7 16-lane slots electrically dedicated. If you need those kind of resources, you need that. But I've got a chart I'll put up that shows how those play out. But I've got another chart as it relates to these machines. If you're curious about the performance of the processor for that entry-level machine that we looked at in the previous video, and this machine, a secondary level for 16 cores. Let's take a look at that. And we put a third processor in here, as I started a while ago to say, if you can't get the 5950, what if you got the one below that, which is 12 cores? I wouldn't mess with it. Now this is a link we'll put up from UserBenchmark that compares the Ryzen 9 5950 to the Ryzen 9 3950 for those that are interested in going that direction. Again, I would stick with the 5950. It's a higher performance. Whether you're doing gaming or whether you're doing content creation, we don't do gaming. We do content creation. We build business computers. But I think you're going to still need the same thing, and that's going to be performance. We'll have this link up. Another link we'll put up is from CPU Monkey that again talks about the similarities and differences. We'll also put a link up into AMD so you can look at the specs and see what the capabilities are of the processor. 16 cores, 32 threads, PCI Express 4. You can look at your wattage, and the wattage is relevant. For those that are interested, there's going to be a new CPU cooler from Noctua, and I believe it's going to be good to like 125 watts, fanless. So if you need to build a machine and it needs to be quiet because you're building a digital audio workstation, that's important. The other issue is if it's in a rack mount, it needs to be away from everything else anyway. But having a having a cooler that does not have a fan, that's a big deal. We've had that. We haven't had it for a long time. Noctua is bringing it back. Now, some of the favorite tests we've used in the past are the CPU benchmark from PassMark. We'll have a link up to the individual processor so you can take a look at it. The Intel i9 10850K and the AMD Ryzen 9 5950. But we took that a step further, and we'll put this link up that compares the two I just mentioned, and the other one, which is the Ryzen 9 5900. And you can see how those play out with performance from 16 cores to 12 cores to 10 cores. More cores, more processing power. Now, as this relates back to the formula that Adobe has put out that we've been able to extrapolate, and I don't think you'll find that information listed yet, but as we look at what's going on with rendering, the last actual test that we ran of rendering, we did, I guess it's going on probably 2 or 3 years ago now, and using just some of the stuff we were doing with Vegas Video, because we use Vegas Pro and we also use DaVinci Resolve. And we have a license for DaVinci Resolve Studio that we're going to do another video about later with the edit panel. But from a standpoint of the specs and how that plays out with number one, the CPU cores times 4 equals RAM, and number two, the CPU core count equals the video RAM. Well, the last test we ran of about 3 years ago on Vegas Pro what we found was that our rendering at that time, 3 years ago, and this was on, I believe, that would have been on a Ryzen 2nd generation, which would be 8 cores, 16 threads. At that time, the software was doing 90% CPU and 10% GPU. Okay, I've thought for a long time video cards are too expensive. I would be real happy to buy a truckload of video cards at $500 right now. I'm just saying. So the last time we ran that test, which was a few weeks ago, I said on a fluke, let's see what Windows says we're doing. Okay, we've got one machine on an X399 where we do most of our rendering with the latest version of Vegas Pro, which I think is now 17, 18, whatever it is. Anyway, with the latest version of Vegas Pro, we ran that test on a fluke just to see how we were doing with resource allocation. And what before had been 90% CPU and 10% GPU got flipped. And what we found was the GPU was doing 80% of the rendering. I thought, wow. So that makes the formula for the GPU all that much more important, all that much more special, and all that much more relevant. Now, I will say that particular machine happens to have a video card. The previous one had a WX 7100. Nice little card for the money. At the time, $500. Can't get one for that now. But when we did the X399, no reason to think anything was going to be different, and it wasn't from what we tested. But with the latest test, that machine happens to have, which I'm ashamed to admit it at the time, but I'll tell you now because it's relevant to this, that machine has, and I'll put a link up to it from AMD, a Radeon Pro WX 9100. And 80% performance improvement on that card. That video card is well matched to that processor and the amount of RAM in that machine. Now, going forward with the kind of machines we're going to be building, Nathaniel is trying to get his hands. The first card he tried was for the RTX 3080 Ti SOL, $1,200 video card, and that didn't work out. So tonight he's supposed to be camping out for tomorrow, and you guys will see this after the fact, so it'll be the next video before I can tell you the results. He's going to try for the next card down that's coming out, which should be around $800. If that doesn't work out, then we've got 3 other options, and they only get more expensive. It won't be $1,200 and it won't be $800. It's going to be $2,000 or more. So as we progress into this, whatever class of machine you're going to build, like Nathaniel is at a 10-year computer, he wants to build another 10-year computer. So as we look at the numbers for what it's going to cost from an entry level to the secondary level, the real key is what is the secondary level cost versus what a high-end desktop, which is the third level. And that high-end desktop, I think, is the best place for most people for a 10-year computer. Just for the numbers, as I talked about the motherboard, $300 versus $600. You get the value in that $600 motherboard. An $850 processor that may cost you $1,000 versus a $2,000 processor. You get the value in that machine because you're going from 16 cores to 32 cores, so you've got more to deal with. And instead of having to decide who's on first, in other words, if I do this, can I do that? Well, if I do that, I got to turn this off. You don't have that. You got 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. So your video gets a dedicated slot, your M.2 card gets a dedicated slot, your Thunderbolt 3 gets a dedicated slot, but Thunderbolt 4, I don't know yet until we can get our hands on that ASRock card, which is a 5-pin header. So there's a lot of stuff here going on. I want to try to simplify it, but I want to give you guys some things to try to pull, because remember, vendors want you to build a new machine about every 18 months to 2 years. And like I said in the previous video, it takes about 9 months to develop a motherboard that has about a 12-month shelf life. And right now, motherboards, as I said, are flying off the shelves. Some of them are coming and going, some of them are hit and miss. But what we're recommending is available. The problem is the video card. And depending on what video card you go with, there's an issue with the power supply, because those 2 issues we're dealing with. And until you can get that other stuff sorted out, video card number 1, then that determines the power supply number 2. The other stuff really doesn't matter, because 2 primary components, which is your motherboard and processor, I wouldn't get until you can get that other stuff allocated. Memory is one thing you can get if you can get your hands on it. Right now, 64 gigs is still a pretty fair deal. The 128 gig kit, which this would support, is outrageous right now. It's cheaper to buy 256 gigs of RAM than it is to buy 128 gigs of RAM based on low profile. Now, I will say, take a look at the memory configurator on ASUS's website. We'll have a link up to it, because the memory that they address to use with this board, and especially if you're going to do gaming, I would focus on the Samsung B die. They have a link up for that. And most of your Samsung B die RAM is going to be G-Skill. So even though we've used Corsair Vengeance because of what Nathaniel wants to do, I would get some memory that could be pushed a little bit further, and that would be the Samsung B die. Let's go back to the specs. Now the other link we've got that the other subscriber asked that got us going on that, and to answer Danielle's questions, let's look at this now as it relates to audio, because the specs for audio are not as clear-cut as they should be. They're kind of muddy. A lot of that talks about what they call the minimum, but even what they call their optimal specs are still, in my opinion, minimum, because we're not looking at a machine that's going to be a 2-year machine. This machine right now we're looking at would be like about a 3-year machine, whereas the machine we're recommending is about a 10-year machine. We got a lot of people coming out of the woodwork saying, wow, I can't believe what all has been changed. And yeah, it's like a train. You know, you're holding on with your knuckles and lead, follow, or move over, because this technology is moving on. Now, to address Danielle's question, let's look at this from a digital audio workstation perspective as a purpose-built computer. I still think this is a better place to be than the primary machine, but you still got the issue of getting a video card. You're going to be limited to what you can do, but if you're doing just that one thing, this will do the job. And what I would suggest for that primary boot drive, put in a 2 terabyte drive, because you're going to have virtual instruments. It's just easier if everything goes to C. Otherwise, you're not going to be using that secondary because you want Thunderbolt 4 support. And if you're doing an audio interface, of the 3, let's say of the 3 Thunderbolt 3 audio interfaces, we've been asked about 2. The audio interface we've been asked about the most is the one from UA Audio, number 2 from Antelope. And the party line on that, because we've had other subscribers asking, can I use on an AMD machine my Thunderbolt audio interface if I buy what you guys have? Those vendors don't know. All they're going to do is tell you book and verses what Intel says. Okay, look, if it works based on what we've shown, where we've done data connectivity and we've done Thunderbolt connectivity, it'll work. It'll work on the AMD if the AMD supports it. And because if you want Thunderbolt 4, it's built onto the motherboard, you're going to have data out of either one of those ports. You're only going to have video out of one of those ports that's built onto the board. What I want to do now is take a look at the specs and show you what they recommend. The best I've got that makes a case for either one of these machines is probably from Fruity Loops. I looked at the stuff Cubase has. It's an extensive list, but it's too vague. I've looked at the stuff from some of the others. Again, it's too vague. I've got the specs from PreSonus. We're going to put those up. We still have 2 Thunderbolt 3 audio interfaces. And I think a question has to be asked, if nobody's asked it yet, will there be a Thunderbolt 4 audio interface? My expectation would be yes, because for Thunderbolt for audio, what you're going to gain from, not just bandwidth in one direction, but bidirectional support. The real question you have to ask is, if you go down that platform with UA Audio or with Antelope, because they are proprietary, you have to decide which proprietary path do you want to follow, because there's no way to take that stuff and bring it to another machine. But each of them, whichever way you go, all depend upon processing power, which is the CPU. And the CPU is more important for a digital audio workstation than a video card. But you still got to have video to see what you're doing, but you can get by as long as you've got a video card that will be supported, because remember, Windows 11 is coming out, and that's supposed to drop in this month of June, about June the 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So let's take a look at some specs. I want to cut to the chase and show you what Fruity Loop has. The others we'll have up as links you can reference. Now, first of all, what are the system requirements for Fruity Loops? And the real question is, what computer should I get for music creation? Okay, as I referenced, Windows 11 is coming out. And my concern, the driver model is going to change. Why do I say that? Okay, I use Focusrite audio interfaces. The mixer for audio that I'm on right now that plugs into the video switch is a Rackmount Focusrite mixer. The Pro Audio interfaces that we use on the other computers that I do stuff with are all Focusrite. Focusrite had a Generation 1. They had to go to a Generation 2. Why is that? Because the driver model changed. There's also a Generation 3. My expectation is the same thing. And my expectation with Windows 11, that's going to happen. So whatever you're going to do with the machine, be mindful, because of Windows 11, I would hold off on buying any kind of Pro Audio interface until after Windows 11 comes out, because if you're going to run the new operating system, you're going to want an audio interface that's going to work in that new operating system. And if the driver model changes, wait. Because if it changes, that can mean a whole new audio interface. We went through that with Windows 98, we went through that with Windows 2000, and we went through that 3 times with Windows 10. So I'm just saying. And yes, there's a way around it for the ASIO driver, but we're trying to keep it simple. Now the question about laptop versus desktop, and right here on the CPU. Now Fruity Loops talks about a processor in the sweet spot of $300 to $500. Okay, they recommend an i9, a 10900, or a 10850, or a 10700. And then on the AMD Ryzen 9, a 5900, a 5800, or a 5600. I agree with where they're at in the range, but we've been very specific on these specs for this purpose, for a purpose-built machine. If you're going to use a digital audio workstation, that entry-level 1 machine that has video on board, if you buy the processor that doesn't have video on board, it's still the same 10 cores. So you might as well get 10 cores and have video. And the Aperture will let you allocate 2 gigs of RAM on that entry-level machine. On this machine, no video on board, you got to have a video card. So I wouldn't do the Ryzen 9 5900 because you're talking 12 cores. I'd do the Ryzen 9 5950 so you get the 16 cores. It's a little more expensive, yeah, but if you want the cores for the processing, you need it. More cores, you can read all about why that is. But I wanted to show you this because this is the best I've seen. And that's about as clear as it gets. We normally don't recommend spending more than $600 on a CPU only for music production. Well, that's their take. You got my take. So you can consider the source. My experience is building computers. Their experience is writing music software, and it's great software. I love it because it allows me to test and put on different machines and see how things work. And that's the program we're going to be using when we test those audio interfaces for Thunderbolt 3, even on Thunderbolt 4 if we build this machine. But if I'm looking at buying a processor versus buying another motherboard, I'm going to buy that other motherboard because of what I know. It's just it is what it is. But I'm not doing either one until I can get my hands on that video card, and that video card determines, it's like dominoes. The video card determines the power supply, then everything else falls into place. Now Fruity Loops has another link about CPU meters and multi-core processing. I'm not going to get into it other than I'll have this in the documentation, in the description, so you can read about this and read up on it on yourself about your processing power and what you're going to need. And I have to remind everybody, like I did in the last video, because of some of the similarities, one issue with a digital audio workstation is DPC latency. That's going to have to be a separate video, but DPC latency means what I may do is have one of those squeeze toys to show you that Windows is not a real-time operating system. It freezes and runs, but it does it really, really fast. And the reason I'm telling you this is if you're going to use this motherboard or any motherboard for a digital audio workstation, one of the first things you're going to turn off is that Wi-Fi on the motherboard. That's nuts. But another video. We'll also have a link up for UA Audio so you can read about their specs and what they require. They're pretty meager. They talk about an i7. When we're talking about video that you're going to capture and streaming through a hardware card, that needs to be done on an i7 or better. What will happen is if you're trying to capture video that you're going to send out on a live stream, you won't get a BSOD, but what you will probably get is a lockup. The computer will just freeze because it can't handle the data on anything less than that. Now, we used to do that on an 8350, but we did only that and nothing else. We had one system that we had a special program for zooming in on because, again, a computer needs to be multi-purpose. That program caused the computer to lock up. It took me quite a while to figure out what was causing the problem. We'd be streaming, and all of a sudden our stream would go poof. We had all this equipment, everything set up, but that one chain in the link was our weak link, and when it broke, it stopped our live stream. Now, we still recorded the meeting that we could put up as a video, but we didn't have a live stream that we were putting out because of one application that was on that computer that allowed us to zoom in and out. Needless to say that when I figured it out, I got rid of that pretty quick. But it took me quite a while to come to that conclusion. It's those little things you learn from experience. And I want to interject while we're looking at this. Anybody that's got a FireWire interface. FireWire was a big deal 10 years ago, and if you have and still have a FireWire interface that works fine, you will probably still be able to use it if you choose, but do not try to install that FireWire card in the machine. Okay, one of our subscribers, and this goes back over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, when he built his Threadripper 3, as we were going through the process, what he found was he could put the card in, but the card would connect and disconnect. It had a conflict. the way the resources were allocated, the way the device enumerated, it just wasn't going to work. So the way to solve that is do not try to put, even if you can get PCI Express card that'll work that has drivers for it, do not put that card in there. What you want to do is get one of the converters that will convert the 1394 FireWire to Thunderbolt. Problem solved. And that'll buy you a little time until we can get past this Windows issue to get you one of the audio interfaces. So I'm going to be curious to see how the audio interfaces that we're going to look at are going to work in the new version of Windows. They may or they may not. I don't know. If the driver model changes, then we could be SOL. We're going to find out. Now, one of our subscribers has asked the vendors about support, and a lot of it's been hit or miss. I think they've had the best support from UA Audio, but they're getting the support from Antelope, but it's been slow. And we'll have a link up, and you can see here they talk about a computer with available USB 2, USB 3, or a Thunderbolt port. That needs to be Thunderbolt 3, Windows 10 64-bit with the updates. Available hard drive space, memory, 4 gigs, 8 gigs recommended, an Intel i3 or an AMD FX. You need an i7, and I wouldn't do an AMD FX. That is about an 8 to 10-year-old computer. You want to be looking at what we're talking about here. The entry-level machine, 10 cores, the secondary level, which is 16 cores, or I'll take you and show you a link we've got in PCPartPicker that'll show you what the numbers look like on the TRX 40. So there's the difference you're looking at. A 32-core processor, double the price and double the performance if you need it. And also on the motherboard, that's $630 right now. From the standpoint of a digital audio workstation, I think this ProArt would do what most people want, but you're going to have some limitations. And our goal today was to talk to you and show you what you can do and what you cannot do. I hope we've been able to clearly communicate that, because there's so many questions going on, and I'm trying to answer them as quickly as I can and to be as complete, concise as we possibly can. So this was strictly an unboxing and overview, but if your head's not spinning, it should be. And I'm hoping now that we've done this in this next video, as we'll either go ahead and take a look at the cards for capturing and streaming, and we may do before that an overview and not even mention these motherboards, just to kind of bring everybody up to speed so you know where we're at and where we're coming from, 1080 and how that all plays out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I want to thank you for watching. My name's Gil Boyd. This is Builder By. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. We're out.